Good afternoon. Who here is a fan of a megastar, Erik Larson? Journalist and author Erik Larson is the author of 6 national bestsellers: The Splendid and the Vile, Dead Wake, In the Garden of Beasts, Thunderstruck, The Devil in the White City, and Isaac's Storm. Collectively, Larson has sold more than 10 million copies. What an amazing achievement. His newest title, The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War, brings to life the 5 months between the election of Abraham Lincoln and the start of the Civil War, and describes the tragic miscalculations made by key men in power who ultimately led America to the brink. The session is moderated by David N. Rubenstein, author and co-founder of Carlyle Group. Enjoy the festival, and let's welcome them to the stage.
So, how many people here have read a book by Erik Larson? Oh, wow. How many people have not read a book by Erik Larson? Oh, okay. Well, you have to leave the room.
Would you stand up, please?
Oh. Okay. So I interviewed you last on your book on Winston Churchill's first year in office. A spectacular book, bestseller. And at that time, I asked you what was your next book, and I think you weren't sure, or at least you wouldn't tell me. But why did you think that the world needed another book on the Civil War? I mean, there have been 100,000 books. What did you think you could add to the Civil War literature already? And didn't you once say you would never write a book on the Civil War?
Okay, thank you. So I am on record, you can Google this, I am on record as having said numerous times that I will never write a book about the Civil War, and I will never write a book about Abraham Lincoln or anything where he's a significant character. So here I am on stage talking about a book about the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln as a key character. I didn't want to do a book about the Civil War because, frankly, I didn't need the grief in my life. You know, a friend of mine, the late Tony Horowitz, unfortunately, he did a book called Confederates of the Attic. Anybody read that book? It's a great book. And he told me he once went to a book signing in Texas, and somebody showed up with an actual live Civil War cannon. And so, no, I didn't want to write about the Civil War. But what happened was, it actually has a lot to do with the pandemic. I blame the pandemic for this. I was in the middle of my book tour for The Splendid and the Vile, the book we spoke about, when the COVID pandemic intensified and suddenly the world locked down. And on March 12th, my wife's birthday, incidentally, I was on a plane home. My tour was over, halfway through. Found myself in our pandemic redoubt on Eastern Long Island. Found myself with a lot of time on my hands that I had not expected to have. And I decided, okay, I'm going to devote this to looking for my next project. And so that's probably when we encountered each other. I was on a fence and looking into other things. I started looking into various ideas. If you recall, about then, there was a good deal of political discord. I kept hearing people talking about otherwise sane people supposedly otherwise sane people talking about secession and Civil War, modern day secession and Civil War. But for whatever reason, I just sort of decided, okay, maybe there's a story. Maybe there's a story in how the Civil War the real Civil War actually got started. You know, I confess I am not a Civil War buff, never was. I had significant gaps in my knowledge about the Civil War. But I thought maybe there was a story. I mean, it's a very, very compelling thing, obviously. So I started wandering around online. I couldn't go, my usual MO would be to go to a physical archive, parachute in without any advance warning, no advance warning to the curators, to anybody, and just see what kind of material was available. Now, obviously, I couldn't do that. You know, my beloved, I'm not just sucking up here, my beloved Library of Congress Madison Reading Room, which is God's gift to researchers. Anybody who does research, we know that this is a fantastic place. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go. So unfortunately, I was consigned to doing online research. started wandering around. Personally, I find online research stultifying. I did find, however, this collection of documents, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. Started reading it, and I found it very compelling. This is brilliantly curated, chronological order, hundreds of documents. Telegram response, letter response, report response, which is the stuff that I live for. I mean, this is great. This is like they were giving me my story. And so I ordered a physical volume. I was able to track down a publisher of those documents. Volume 1, of course. It arrived at my pandemic readout. I disinfected it. I did. And once again, jumped into this, and I just found it incredibly compelling. So I started, it's sort of the ultimate suspense novel, tension. It's got everything. Only mine is not a novel. So I started looking into it. I was still wandering around looking at some other ideas. I wasn't completely committed. Then came the events of January 6, 2021. And as I watched that unfold from my office, I'll never forget that afternoon, I felt this array of emotions: anxiety, fear, suspense, what was going to happen. And I thought to myself, wow, here's this thing unfolding on TV, the documents that I've just been reading about for the last couple of months, for the last year, actually, could have been written today. So that's what made me decide, okay, this may have some relevance.
Right. So when you picked this topic, how much research did you actually do? How many, is it a year and a half of research, and how do you research then write, or do you research and write, or all your research first and then write?
Yeah, it's kind of a hybrid of all of that stuff. What happens the first thing of all is that I always do a very detailed book proposal. Because I want to know what I'm getting into, but once I commit to a contract with a publisher. My agent keeps telling me, look, at this point in your career, just write a letter. Just tell them this is what I want to do. That would be terrifying on the day that I got the contract and started work on the story. So I always do a lot of advanced research. The book proposal for me is a sample chapter, an essay, lengthy essay about why this might be a compelling thing, where the resources are, what the actual story is, and then a capsule outline, which is a vital thing for me. A capsule outline that has each chapter that I could envision at that point. The idea being to try to see what the narrative arc is, just see if it's there. And it was for me. So I did my book proposal, and that represents about 6 months of concerted research. Then I dive in for the project. I do the heavy-duty research, a lot of material. Still, archives were closed or their schedules were very funky, so I still couldn't dive in for a while. But I found a lot of great primary records online. Anybody who's into Lincoln, the complete works of Abraham Lincoln is accessible to anybody online. It is wonderful. And the Library of Congress databases are just tremendous. And then finally, I was able to get out of my lockdown condition. Now, I have to say, as a writer, lockdown is what I do, so it was not that awful. But I was finally able to get out and go to the Library of Congress, go to the Madison Reading Room, and above all, get to Charleston.
So your publisher probably didn't expect, and I don't know if you expected, that this would become the #1 New York Times bestseller, because the Civil War is a long time ago, and the battle on Fort Sumter many people wouldn't have thought would be the most exciting part. Were you surprised that it became the #1 New York Times bestseller?
Yeah, I was. I hoped. I thought by the time I was done with the book, I actually thought, hey, this is not a bad story. This is sort of the TikTok, not the social media TikTok, but the TikTok, as we journalists like to say, this is the TikTok of the advance toward America's greatest tragedy. How could it be anything but to me at least, very compelling. I don't really understand the dynamics of bestseller lists. I don't understand what makes a book, reach the list. One thing I would like to just point out, though, that I have actually had 7 bestsellers, because that includes Demon. Anyway.
That's pretty good. So,
and it's not, actually not 10 million, it's 12.
So have you already picked the subject for your next book?
Yes.
But you can't say what it is yet?
I will never tell. So no, this is actually the first time in my career as a writer of narrative nonfiction that by the time I finished one book, I actually knew what I was going to do. Okay. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'll tell you why. I won't in a moment. But this is something that has been gestating for about a decade, and because of various contractual issues and timing issues with other works and so forth, I just couldn't do it. But now I'm going to do it, and I will tell you the zone of history. I'm going back to the Gilded Age, which delights me. But beyond that, I won't tell you because never talk about future works, because I'm a terrible pitcher. I would fail in Hollywood if I had to do this, because if I told you my next idea, you would look at me like, okay, you know, and I can't have that in my mind for 4 years. When I learned this most vividly was when I was at a family reunion on Long Island with my extended family, my sisters and so forth, and I was working on my book, actually, Thunderstruck, about Marconi and England's second most famous murderer. And my sister, my oldest sister, came up to me. You know, everybody had a few beers and so forth. And she came up to me and she started badgering me to get to know what the book was. She said, come on, you never tell what it is, just tell me. So I thought, it's all among friends here, it's family, you know. So I told her the idea, and she goes, oh, I wouldn't read that. 4 years of that running through my head is like a 22 caliber bullet from The Sopranos, you know, just bouncing around in my brain.
For those who haven't read the book, let's try to summarize it briefly.
Yep.
The essence of it is that there was an effort by a number of southern states led by South Carolina to secede from the Union. Right. And this began more or less under President Buchanan before Lincoln. So what was the main concern that the South Carolina legislature had, and the man who was leading that, Mr. Ruffin?
Well, he was one of the players in the whole thing.
But what was the main concern? Why would they want to secede? What was the problem?
The South, particularly South Carolina, had long felt itself to be subjected to the tyranny of federal rule, particularly of northern rule. South Carolina had always been a touchy, or tetchy, as they would say back then, a touchy state in terms of its alleged rights and what it could and could not do, even at the point where the Constitution, the various elements of it were being negotiated. South Carolina was first and foremost to say that there had to be something in the Constitution that would allow the foreign slave trade to continue in perpetuity. The other negotiators, people from the North and so forth, or more wise and humane souls, would not go for that. So there was this significant conflict that yielded, as a footnote, this promise in the in the Constitution that for 20 years the United States would not ban the foreign slave trade. Footnote number 2, 20 years almost to the time, the United States actually banned the foreign trade back in 1808. Yes? Eight. So South Carolina had always been this irascible state, so irascible actually that other states were embarrassed by its behavior in the year before the whole secession thing. They agreed with the concept of secession, but they didn't want this crazy state to be the leader because they felt it would devalue the meaning of secession in the world's eye. So one thing leads to another. South Carolina in 1832 leads the so-called nullification effort. They just decided, okay, again, citing the Constitution, but not really, the idea that in South Carolina they could nullify any federal law they chose, and happily, Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, was like, no, that's not going to happen. The story advances. South Carolina continues to feel like it's been completely abused. Big element, the fuel in South Carolina was, of course, slavery. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, it was all about slavery. Early in the 1800s, planters tended to see slavery as a necessary evil. Over time, that changed for a very important reason. The world began moving rapidly away from slavery, led by Britain. The abolition movement rose in the North, and this was, for Southern planters, this was an existential threat. Their entire culture, their lives, were based on this enslaved body of people, 4 million slaves in the South, X whatever in South Carolina. To eliminate slavery would be not just to eliminate the free labor that allowed these people to do what they did and get quite rich, was also to eliminate the capital base upon which they functioned. I mean, you could, and they did, you could get a mortgage on land secured by the bodies of your enslaved people. This was capital. And when Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, November 6, 1860, Southern planters saw this as the end of their world because they believed that Lincoln had one goal, that his goal was to abolish slavery completely. That was not his goal. That was not his goal at all at that point. But the South, led by fire eaters, activists, this gentleman, not a gentleman actually, but Edmund Ruffin, had just become convinced that Lincoln was going to do this. Same time, there had also been a movement in South Carolina, led by South Carolina, but also became commonplace throughout the South, was the pro-slavery movement. Because the North was moving more and more radically against slavery, the South managed to persuade itself, pro-slavery writers, that slavery was the best of all things, not just for the planters, but for the enslaved. So you have this massive split happening, which led to, with Lincoln's election, that was the final conflagration.
So South Carolina secedes from the Union when Buchanan is president. Mm-hmm. Buchanan doesn't really do much about it.
Nothing.
Lincoln is elected president in November, doesn't take office till March.
Right.
He says in his inaugural address, I'm not going to do anything to affect slavery where it already exists because it's protected by the Constitution.
Right.
So why did people in the South and the South Carolina particularly not take him at his word? He said, I'm not going to get rid of slavery where it already exists. It's protected by the Constitution. Why didn't they believe him?
That is one of the mysteries of the whole saga. It's like, I think you can kind of come back to another sort of contemporary thing we have now. And back then, they were in their own echo chamber. They had come to believe that Lincoln was going to abolish slavery, that he could say all he wanted about protecting slavery, but he didn't really mean it. That's the thing. So they persuaded themselves that this guy was the Antichrist. And when you have that kind of situation, nothing's going to shake it.
All right, so if South Carolina secedes from the Union, that means that the Union forts and Union troops in South Carolina are not really they're in a foreign country in effect now.
Right. Let me just sketch the situation in Charleston Harbor in that period. The United States, the federal government, possessed numerous establishments in the Charleston Harbor area. One was Fort Moultrie. One was Castle Pinckney. There was an arsenal, a Revolutionary War fort that was pretty much obsolete, and there was Fort Sumter. Sumter at this time was incomplete. Construction had begun in 1828. And it was still not complete. The guns had not been mounted. The fortress was meant to have 650 soldiers. At this point, before the action begins, it had essentially none. Some laborers who were working on the fort. So the U.S. controlled these properties, and that really rankled South Carolina. That really rankled because, again, they felt that the North was this tyrannical force. And here in the harbor was this federal presence, and this Fort Sumter galled them the most. It had this gigantic flag flying from the top of this fortress with 50-foot walls and 3 tiers of guns and so forth. It really pissed them off. And so the United States became concerned about this after Lincoln's election, after the declaration of secession. Oh, actually, even before Lincoln's election, the United States Army put a new commander in charge of the federal properties in Charleston Harbor, Robert Anderson, Major Robert Anderson, who, if there's a hero in my book, it is Major Robert Anderson. Interestingly, Anderson was a Southerner by birth. He was a former slaveholder. His wife was from a prominent slaveholding family in Georgia. He was put in charge of the federal presence in Charleston Harbor. He arrives, he becomes aware immediately, especially after Lincoln's election, which happened soon afterwards, that things are getting really dangerous down there in South Carolina, that the population of South Carolina is ready, literally for war. They want these guys out. South Carolina declares secession. I think it was in December 20 of 1860, if my recollection is correct. And then things start getting really, really tetchy down there, and then all the Anderson and his men feel it. Incidentally, he has only 75 men under his command at this point. And again, Fort Sumter was meant to have 650. So comes Christmas, the day after Christmas, the night after Christmas, Anderson executes this brilliant plan to secretly move all his men from Fort Moultrie across Charleston Bay into Fort Sumter. The next morning, the Charlestonians, the way they realize that this has happened is because smoke and flames are pouring from Fort Moultrie over on Sullivan's Island, because Anderson has left behind some officers and men to burn the gun carriages and to spike the cannon inside the fort. So the Charlestonians awake after having this wonderful Christmas holiday, to see that Moultrie is on fire and to see that Fort Sumter has been occupied by federal troops. They could not, they just could not stand this. So immediately, South Carolina seizes Fort Moultrie, seizes Castle Pinckney, seizes the federal arsenal, and demands Anderson to surrender his Sumter.
So when Lincoln becomes president, does he decide, well, look, Fort Sumter is now in a state that has seceded, so we got to get our troops out? Or should we keep them there to say that we're not really recognizing the secession, and therefore we should keep these troops in the fort because it's still an American fort?
Right. So Lincoln's attitude was that we're not going to surrender. We're not going to surrender Fort Sumter. But remember, at this point, he is not yet officially the president of the United States. He has been elected. But Lincoln had, I'm talking still in the period of late 1860 and the early part of 1861, before the inauguration. Lincoln is enough of a lawyer to know that enough of a respecter of the Constitution and legality of things, that he is not going to be president until two things happen. The electoral votes are counted, and his inauguration takes place on March 4th, 1861. Interestingly, by the way, the two moments of gravest national concern in 1861, prior to the start of the Civil War, were would the electoral count come off as it should, and would the inauguration come off? Would Lincoln actually, A, make it to Washington, B, would he actually survive, and would the inauguration happen? Doesn't that sound familiar, right? And so Lincoln decides that he doesn't want to throw gasoline onto this fire that's already burning in the country. He decides essentially to keep quiet until his inauguration. He's not totally quiet. He sort of seeds the atmosphere through friendly politicians, friendly editors, and so forth, but he stays essentially quiet. So what's happening then is you have James Buchanan, President Buchanan, who the one thing he wants at this point is to get out of his administration without a war on his time. And he's doing anything he can. At one point he talks to Congress and he says essentially, I can't do anything, I give up. He says it's up to Congress. And we know how effective Congress is. So you have Buchanan, this vacuum in Washington. You have Lincoln not wanting to plunge into things until March 4th. And you have the U.S. government at this point. The Buchanan's cabinet is very much Southern-facing. His Secretary of War eventually fled to join Confederate forces. Anderson is left there in the harbor with no orders, essentially no orders as to what to do. And you know, this is the situation. And South Carolina starts ramping up. They appoint General Beauregard to put him in charge of the Southern forces in Charleston Harbor. He immediately starts installing cannon emplacements throughout the harbor. So what had happened there is that when South Carolina initially seceded in December 20, Fort Sumter, you know, they were Anderson and his men after that were installing guns and so forth. But there was no real threat to federal forces because these cannon emplacements had not been erected yet. So who knows? Maybe could Buchanan have done something at that point? You know, that's one of the eternal questions. But what happens as the story advances, and the reason I really loved the story in the end was because there are so many fine points that I didn't know about these political manipulations and the importance to Lincoln and his government after March 4th of not, as you pointed out, not recognizing the South. They went to lengths that I think are actually quite almost comical as this whole story unfolded. It's just fascinating to me.
So Lincoln decides he doesn't want to give up Fort Sumter because that would be symbolic that we are recognizing the secession of South Carolina. But does he send more armaments and food and other supplies to Fort Sumter to make sure they can hold out for any attacks that might occur?
Right. This is the question that confronted Lincoln literally the day after his March 4th inauguration, because Major Anderson had sent a report saying that basically he was running out of everything and would have to surrender the fort. Lincoln was trying to decide at that point what to do. Do we reinforce the fort? Do we surrender the fort? He sends 3 different emissaries down to South Carolina to try to determine the extent of pro-Union opinion. He, like others, like his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, had been under the impression that there was a lot of pro-Union sentiment in the South. It just hadn't been revealed yet. So he sends these emissaries down, and he learns in short order that there is no pro-Union sentiment, at least not in Charleston. And so then the question confronts him: what do we do? To send an armed expedition into Charleston Harbor at this point would have been suicide for those who were entering the harbor, because Beauregard had so reinforced it that it would have been a disaster. But he comes to the opinion that he has to do something. So he does something that's really very clever. He decides, okay, we're going to send essentially humanitarian aid. We're going to send food and non-military supplies to Fort Sumter. And he notifies the governor of South Carolina. He says, this is what we're going to do. If you do not molest this expedition, we will simply unload the supplies, and we will leave the harbor, and the status quo will be preserved. And he knew, I have to believe, that South Carolina at this point was not going to go for this. And so, indeed, the expedition is raised. Word of this is signaled to South Carolina, to Charleston via telegraph, which was present and very, very active media element at this point. South Carolina then realizes, okay, they don't believe him. They don't believe that this is just an expedition that's bringing food and humanitarian supplies. They are convinced that this is a military expedition with the intention of seizing Charleston, seizing Charleston, seizing and reinforcing, not seizing, but reinforcing Fort Sumter, and so forth. And that's why they finally decided, okay, this is over, and the bombardment ultimately.
So they bombard Fort Sumter, and was Fort Sumter, how many American soldiers were in Fort Sumter at the time? Was it a large group?
So by the time this all gets to the point of the bombardment, Anderson has jumped into the fort with his men, 75 men, that's all he has, 75. And again, the fort was built to have 650 men. So he is vastly outnumbered. They have managed to put a lot of cannon into the fort. He's ready for action. And then, the bombardment begins.
Bombardment begins, but is the fort surrendered because the fort is falling apart, it's on fire, or because they don't have enough supplies to fight back, or they just don't have enough food to fight back or stay there?
Well, essentially both things. The supply of food was essentially non-existent, but also the bombardment had caused a fire within Fort Sumter that was so intense, so smoky, so overwhelming that there really was no alternative. And finally, Anderson decides that actually it's a very funny moment there. Anderson decides, okay, it's time. It's time
So normally when you surrender in a military situation like that, those who surrender are taken as prisoners of war. But were these soldiers taken as prisoners of war, or were they allowed to go back to the north?
No, what happened was Anderson was given a promise. This is because of the sort of gentlemanly relationship between Beauregard and Anderson. They were friends, and one was his pupil and at West Point and so forth. And friends to the point, though, that it didn't stop Beauregard from essentially constructing enough weapons to destroy Anderson and all his men. But they came to an agreement that Anderson would be able to march out of the fort bearing the American flag, and have a 100-gun salute. This is going to be a very honorable removal for him. And his men were going to be taken wherever they wanted to go in the north. And that's how it came to an end. Now, we promised questions.
Yes, we're going to have some questions. Just one final question I want to ask you. Lincoln was a person who was he's very smart, not well educated, but he consistently, you point out, spelled Fort Sumter incorrectly.
Yep, Sumter. Sure.
How do you spell it, and how did he spell it?
Okay, it's spelled S-U-M as in Mary, T-E-R. He spelled it S-U-M-P as in Peter, T-E-R. But this is one reason I really fell for Lincoln. The best thing was he could not spell inauguration. He could not spell inauguration.
Well, okay, we have time for questions. Who has questions, stand up and come to the mic, ask your question. Hopefully it's a question, not a statement, just a question.
Oh, it's a race to the mics.
Hi there. I love your books, every one of them. And
Can you say that again?
I really love your books. I've been a Civil War buff until I found out some of my ancestors were in Andersonville. But one thing that always struck me was relating to my family. There's a General Winfield Scott, who I'm related to on my mother's side.
Oh, are you? Okay.
And he offered the command of the Union Army to someone who served under him, Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee turned it down. And usually, historians just skip over this. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on what would have happened if he had said yes.
I can't, speculative history is something I just don't do. I won't do it.
Okay.
I want to add a footnote about Winfield Scott. It's very important. I mentioned the fact that the concerns about would the electoral count come off, right?
Yeah.
And General Winfield Scott, he was at this point the commanding general of the United States Army. He was on his last legs. He was like 6'4", 350 pounds or something. He had every ailment imaginable. But this guy was loyal to America, not to a fault, but he was loyal to America. He was not going to let anybody interfere with this electoral count. So he fills Washington with troops, cannon, cavalry, and he makes this wonderful pledge that anybody tries to interrupt the electoral count, I'm going to strap him to the front of a cannon and manure the hills of Arlington, Virginia with his body.
Well, Winfield Scott was old, but he wasn't old enough to be president of the United States, was he? How old was he?
Yeah,
He was in the early 70s, I think he
somebody
was.
Google that.
Okay.
Yeah, he ran for president.
Right.
He lost, though.
Right. Okay, next
Thank you.
question.
Next question. Thank you, sir.
Hi, I first encountered one of your books as a text in an American Studies class. So I'm curious, as a student of history myself, how do you decide when you're writing narrative nonfiction how much context you need to build for yourself? You said that you weren't a Civil War history buff before this process, and how much your audience also, how much context you need to build for your audience as well.
That's a good question. You know, I need to be absolutely confident that I've got it nailed before I can actually start writing something. You know, we have a name for that. It's like immersion research, immersion journalism, and so forth. And it's basically it's not anything particularly mysterious. It's reading everything you can possibly read, and just try to get to the point where you really have a good sense of this stuff. Was it Isaac Storm that was the book you came across?
It was Devil in the White City.
Devil in the White City. Oh, okay. So they forgave me for Isaac Storm, I guess.
Okay.
Anyway. So that's.
Hi, I had a question about your book, In the Garden of Beasts.
Yep.
I'd read that Tom Hanks had bought the movie rights to it like more than a decade ago. And I was
sure know how to hurt a guy.
I was curious why
it
he
now.
didn't hurry up and make that movie, because I
don't
think
know.
had he made it, I've actually tweeted this several times to you, had he made it before 2016, I think it would have gotten a broader audience. People would have recognized what was happening. Do you think so?
Well, just about every book of mine is or was under option. How many films have been made? None. and I allowed myself last year one moment. Usually I endorse the philosophy of Tom Wolfe, who once said, when you're dealing with Hollywood, you take your book to the fence, hand it over, take the bag of money, and run. But last year, I learned that Keanu Reeves had signed on to play Burnham in Devil in White City, and I thought, wow, this is real. He actually signed a compensation package. He actually signed a contract. So I thought, this is going to happen. So the agent who had actually negotiated that option, no longer my agent, but no, it's not a pejorative thing. Once I learned that, I mean, I sent her because to give her I sent her a very expensive bottle of champagne, $360 a bottle of champagne, champagne that Churchill used to drink of all things, but yet this was for Devil in the White City. And then, like 3 days later, on a Friday evening, I hear from my agent, well, Keanu Reeves has dropped out. The director dropped out. And I was actually letting myself be really depressed that night. And then the next day, I don't know if you know the Hemingway short story Up in Michigan, where the character says, it was noon before he remembered that his heart was broken.
Oh.
Okay.
So it was not that big a deal.
Question?
You've written about a lot of interesting people in history, and who would you most like to meet and have lunch with, potentially?
Oh, Martha Dodd. No. No. My favorite character of all the characters in my books was Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect in Chicago for the World's Fair. Just a brilliant guy. Just every thought that went through that guy's head was just original. His materials at the Library of Congress, you can go and read his materials. I swear he never wrote an unoriginal sentence in his life. So I would really like to, I think, spend time with him. And Churchill. I mean, who wouldn't?
Okay.
You spoke of other federal forts along the southern states, especially around Florida. How important were they in the lead up to the Civil War?
One fort in particular was mixed up actually in the whole conflict over Sumter. That was I'm blocking, Fort Pinckney, right? Yes, the one off Fort Lauderdale. I'm getting my P's screwed up. Anyway, big sea fortress. Similarly, an offense to the Confederates. Different situation because it would have been impossible for the Confederate Navy to actually seize it. But it was a symbolic thing all the same, and that was successfully reinforced by Lincoln and his Navy. But beyond that, a lot of the southern states simply seized federal properties and held them.
Question?
Yeah. So a lot of historical figures that you've written about have been really kind of mythologized in our culture. And so how do you approach that as a writer, trying to get back to like they were a real person at the time?
That's something that I deal with all the time. I refuse to succumb to hagiography. I mean, even Lincoln. I basically said to myself, okay, I'm going to make Lincoln prove to me that he needs to be a character in this book. Now, obviously, he needed to be, but it was little things like his sense of humor, his warmth, the fact that he couldn't spell. These are the things that really appealed to me. But I'm always aware that I don't want to play into what is presumed. I don't want to write assumed history. So it's not that hard. I mean, you just call it the way you see it. And let the facts, let the stories that you come across in diaries and so forth, let them guide you through the story.
Okay, we have time for one more, I think. One more question.
Hello, I really loved Devil in the White City. Thank you for being here. I'm curious, knowing what you know now, what's the one thing that you wish you knew when you first started writing? And was there anything that shifted for you to be able to write consistently?
You mean when I first started writing Devil in the White City?
And just in terms of your career.
Oh, what I wished I knew?
Yeah.
Boy. I wish I hadn't been so diffident starting out. I dilly-dallied. As if I had a coat of arms, I would use a quote from one of Jimmy Buffett's songs, which is, "Indecision may or may not be my problem."
Yeah.
So you won't tell us the subject of your next book, but you tell us approximately when you think it might come out, or it's too hard to predict?
Oh, that's funny. My publisher wants to know that, too. We're thinking, actually, 2 to 3 years, because I've done a lot of research already.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank Erik Larson.
I want to thank you. Thank you. Thank you.